So today is the first Saturday in September, and it's another in the Medway Yacht Club Wayfarer series. It was a day that promised very little. The forecast was for a cloudy day with about 6 knots of wind. Not that inspiring really. But what we actually got was a sunny day with a solid 10 to 15 knots, which was supported by a sea breeze from the east, which is probably the best direction for Medway Yacht Club because we get a fairly steady breeze over the entire course, and we had an incoming tide with plenty of water. I'll talk about the decisions to make at the start in a minute because it's a bit hectic now. We're just behind Hercules Hound in their dirty air, not my best start, and Muffin is just inside us with Moonshine just behind us. How you went up this first beat would pretty much dictate how the race would go for you. So let's see what happens. Now of course, we might only be seconds into the race, but I'm already looking behind because I know I can't live in this dirty air from Hercules Hound. I've got two options. I tack to clear my air, but I've got Moonshine just behind me inside me, who I'd almost certainly infringe if I did it, or a foot off, but that takes me out into the tide. Fortunately of course, Moonshine is just behind me and having the same problems with dirty air that I was having, so they couldn't hold their lane. So as soon as they dropped down to leeward enough for us to tack, we went. Now we couldn't go far in this direction of course because Muffin was there, and the two tacks would have cost us a bit of time, partly because a Wayfarer is a big heavy boat to accelerate, but mainly because Hannah and I, although we're starting to get coordinated, are hardly really getting much pump out of the tack, are we? Anyway, doesn't matter. We've tacked, we've cleared our air, and at least now we've got our own lane. So as you would have seen, Muffin had to tack themselves once we were in front of them to get a clear air for themselves, and Moonshine, trying to stay out the tide, was following them into the shore. We headed on out. You can see Hercules Hound in front of us. Because they had the best start and haven't had to tack, they built a healthy lead, but they are out into the tide, so it's not as big as it looks. Just behind them is Loose Knots, who started in the middle of the tide but did have clear air and a good lane, so they're doing very well out of it. So this is all changing quicker than my commentary can keep up. As you've seen, Hercules Hound and Loose Knots tack to get back inside and out of the tide. We stand on a bit further to make sure we've got clear air and tack ourselves. Of course on the way back in, we meet Hercules Hound coming back out. They've probably seen Muffin and Moonshine taking up the whole inside lane and figured they don't want to get involved in that. They'll go back out where the wind's stronger and clearer, but in the tide. So tacking back in through the moorings like this brings with it its own challenges. You've not only got to find a lane amongst the boats you're racing with, but you've got to find a lane through the moored boats. You don't want to find yourself having to tack and having nowhere to go. This leg also taught us another valuable lesson. You'll notice Muffin and Moonshine are having the short tack up the inside shore, partly I suspect because they want to, but also because there's a line of truck moorings on the inside here, which are regular moorings that are all tied together, which forms a wall effectively they can't get through. By coming in just past the end of this, we've A, saved a tack, but B, it's brought us in just in front of them, which would let us have clear air and control the race. It was also a lesson we'd remember for further up the beat. So now we're feeling good about the race. We're now not having things dictated to us by the boats around us. We've got a clear lane, we're out of the tide. It's the next cross that could dictate how the rest of the race is going to go. We tack when we get to the shore, but on the way back out we find Hercules Hound coming in. They of course can now see that they've got clear of Muffin and Moonshine and are looking at us. But the damage done by spending that extra time in the tide is clearly evident here, as we pass a boat length or so in front. So I've talked about all the tactics up this beat and what we did to try and get clear air, but to be honest, it's this bit that made all the difference. I said at the beginning the wind is quite steady from the east, and it was, but there was a very subtle oscillation in its direction. I don't think we'd noticed it up until now, but when we came out of this tack, we were definitely, say, 10 degrees higher than we were before. which when you've got the tide can actually make a significant difference. And we've come out of it on the right side of it. This lift would now give us a nice long leg up this side of the river without the need to do any tacks. We'd have to duck a couple of the moored boats to clear a space, but it would let us extend a bit on the boats that were on the wrong side of this lift. At the very least, have to have one short tack out on a header. The other thing worthy of note is the boat you can see behind us. That's Wild Thing. They'd started on the other side of the river. Haven't seen them all race, but they obviously did all the right things up that side while the rest of us were squabbling over tacks on this side of the river. And of course, like us, they're now on the right side of this shift, so looking good. So let's talk briefly about the start. The start line is the red line shown on the map, and we're going towards the right. The tide's coming in, and the wind is pretty much blowing straight down the river. There's moored boats on both sides, more on the north shore, but then there is a lot more space over there. The south shore only has a couple of lines, but some of those are trots, which means the amount of space is significantly smaller. I suspect in many ways it would have been easier to make the start on the north shore. We'd have had more space if everyone else had been over there, and probably more options. But A, it's further from the mark, but the real reason for not going there were the toppers. There were loads of them. It was an open meeting at the club this weekend, and they'd all accumulated on the north shore between the Medway Yacht Club and the Wilsonian Yacht Club. So for us, it was a no-brainer. We were going to go on the south side along St Mary's Island. But as you've seen by the fact that Wild Thing has come across the river towards us and is doing really well, there really wasn't anything wrong with wherever you started. You just had to make a good job of it. So do you remember me saying a short while ago when we cut in around the end of the line of trots that had trapped Muffin and Moonshine that we'd learnt a lesson there and applied it a bit further up the beat? Well, this is it. Coming up is another line of trots, and we don't want to find ourselves in the position of having to short tack out around it. So we'd come up this beat, hanging on to that port tack as long as we could, so that we could tack out into the tide and then tack again, not when we reached the line of moored boats like we'd be doing the rest of the leg, when we made the ley line to get inside this line of trots. This way, we're as close to St Mary's Island as we can be, but far enough out to mean that we won't have to short tack in this gap. The hope being as well that maybe that's far enough to get us round the corner. As it turned out, it wasn't, but at the time it seemed like a good plan. One other thing worth mentioning while there's not much happening is keeping the boat flat, with the possible exception of some scows like toppers and so forth. Basically, any sailing dig you made will nearly always benefit from being flat, and the Wayfarer, to be frank, is no exception. But with one caveat: Hannah and I are quite light for the boat, and there is a lot of sail area, so it's very easy to be overpowered. In fact, this is a peachy day with not that much wind, and to be frank, we were fully depowered a lot of the time. But the reason I mention it is because it's also a very beamy boat, and to some extent, on a beat, you can benefit from just letting it heel a bit. You gain all that extra righting moment then as the leeward side of the boat digs in and you're obviously still sitting out, which offsets any loss you get from the centreboard in the boat not being completely flat. I think, all things being equal, you still want to have the boat flat. But if you're lightweight like us, and there's only so much you can depower it, sometimes letting it heel isn't as bad as a die-hard dinghy sailor might think. Anyway, I need to wrap this up here. Several reasons, but mainly because the SD card in the camera that's on the front filled up because I'd forgotten to format it. The battery in the camera on the back went flat halfway through the race. Partly because it was a very long race, but partly I suspect because I'd forgotten to charge it as well. But anyway, not much else happened, I'm afraid. We did go on to win it, but it wasn't because of anything clever in the rest of the race. The gap was made at the start here. This is what decided it for us. Moonshine punched through to get second, with Muffin third and Hercules Hound fourth. But I think all agreed, on a day that didn't promise much, this turned out to be a fantastic day's sailing.